I knew Elizabeth. She was kind. She was strong. A mother. If someone told me that it would end like this, I would have never believed them.
The voice fades, leaving the echo of grief to hang in the air. Then, silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the suffocating silence of something that has gone terribly wrong. It was the morning of October 12, 2017, in Texas. The sun had barely pushed its way past the horizon, and yet the streets already carried a weight heavier than the air itself. A car sat abandoned in a quiet neighborhood, its engine off, its keys still in the ignition, the driver's seat empty, but not forgotten. Inside, the silence whispered fear. To the trained eye of investigators, and to the aching heart of Elizabeth Arellano's family, this was not a careless mistake. This was a signal. Elizabeth Pule Arellano, 31 years old, was a mother of two. To her children, she was warmth and laughter, bedtime stories and birthday cakes. To her sisters, she was the one who showed up no matter how late the night. To her friends, she was the woman who balanced exhaustion and hope, often in the same breath. She was not the type to simply vanish, and yet, vanish she did. The night before, she had been at her parents' home, a place of refuge, as she navigated a strained marriage. Her estranged husband, Rudy Arellano, had once been the center of her life, but by then he had become a shadow looming over her, a presence that turned love into fear, promises into threats. Elizabeth wanted peace, but separation often ignites what love has already burned. People think leaving is the end, says Dr. Melissa Crawford, a domestic violence specialist interviewed later in the case. But leaving can actually be the most dangerous moment. It challenges control, it shatters the image, and for some men, that's a wound they try to fix with violence. The camera of hindsight frames Elizabeth's disappearance not as an isolated act of cruelty, but as part of a larger epidemic. In the United States, on average, nearly 3 women are killed every day by a current or former partner. Elizabeth was not a statistic when she was alive, but the cruel truth of her story is that she became one. The clues started stacking almost immediately. Her car, left behind. Her phone, silent. Her absence, unexplainable. Neighbors recalled hearing nothing unusual, but her sisters described a gut-deep dread when Elizabeth did not return home. "I called and called," her sister Johanna would later testify, her voice trembling on the witness stand. "I thought maybe she was with her kids, maybe she was at a friend's house. But by morning, I knew something was wrong." Law enforcement arrived quickly, scouring her last known locations. Every corner, every shadow, every possibility. In cases like this, time is everything. But time was already slipping away. By the time the investigation widened, a name began to surface with the stubbornness of truth. Rudy Arellano, a husband, a father, and now, the last person linked to Elizabeth before she disappeared. At first glance, his life looked ordinary. A man with a job, a family, a home in a neighborhood like any other. But behind the curtains of normalcy, investigators would soon uncover something darker. Concrete. Rope. Surveillance footage. Cell tower pings that defied his words. And beneath it all, a betrayal so profound that it left Elizabeth's family not just grieving, but searching for answers, for justice, for the last pieces of a life cut short. This is not just a case. It is a story of silence, of concrete, of a woman whose final hours unravel a lesson written in blood and water. This is the story of Elizabeth Pule Arellano. To understand the depth of this tragedy, you have to first understand who Elizabeth was. Elizabeth Pule Arellano was not just a name on a case file. She was a daughter born into a tight-knit family that carried their roots with pride. Her childhood was filled with a kind of small but meaningful rituals families cling to: Sunday dinners, holiday laughter, birthday candles blown out with her sisters gathered close. Her mother would later describe her as the light of the house, always willing to help, always making sure everyone else was okay before herself. As she grew, Elizabeth carried that same giving spirit into adulthood. She became a nurse. Long hours, grueling shifts, but she wore her maroon scrubs like armor. To patients, she was gentle hands and soft words. To coworkers, she was someone you could count on. She just had this way, a colleague remembered. You could be scared out of your mind, but when she walked in, you felt like maybe it was going to be okay. She met Rudy Arellano young, and at first he seemed like the kind of man who could match her energy. He was attentive, charismatic in small ways, a steady presence. They married, and soon after 2 children followed, a boy and a girl who became Elizabeth's heartbeat. Friends would say she poured herself into motherhood with the same devotion she gave her patients. But somewhere between those beginnings and the fall of 2017, something shifted. Arguments grew sharper. Distance grew wider. Rudy's temper, once hidden, began to flash more often. To Elizabeth, who believed in loyalty and family, leaving was not an easy choice. But by late 2017, she had made a decision that millions of women face every year. She separated from her husband, hoping that distance would bring peace. It is here that experts point out a chilling truth. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 75% of women killed by an intimate partner are murdered after leaving or attempting to leave. That moment, the breaking of ties, can flip a switch in an abuser's mind, turning fear of loss into an obsession with control. Elizabeth's family noticed the tension but hoped time apart might cool the storm. She stayed close to her parents, leaning on her sisters, keeping her children shielded from the turbulence. To the outside world, she carried herself with quiet strength. But behind closed doors, she confided her fears. She told me she didn't trust him anymore. Alejandra Pule, her younger sister, later shared. She said she was trying to be careful. She thought distance would keep her safe. It was a hope that countless survivors cling to, that leaving would mean freedom. But for Elizabeth, separation wasn't safety. It was the trigger. On the evening of October 11, 2017, Elizabeth drove to her parents' home. The night was ordinary, the way most nights are before they turn extraordinary in the worst possible way. She wore her scrubs, fresh from work, still marked by the fatigue of long shifts, but also the relief of family waiting for her. She kissed her children. She spoke softly with her sisters. She laughed in that way that made everyone else laugh, too. No one in that house knew they were seeing her for the last time. Later that night, her car would be found, the keys still in the ignition, the driver's seat empty, and a silence that would stretch across hours, then days, pulling her family into a nightmare they could not wake from. When Elizabeth didn't return home, her sisters felt the dread first. I called her phone again and again, Johanna recalled. Every ring felt like it was mocking me. Deep down, I knew, but I didn't want to believe. By morning, the police were called. Missing person reports filed. The first threads of an investigation pulled tight. Officers took note of the abandoned car, the eerily undisturbed scene. To trained eyes, it was a red flag. To her family, it was a living horror. And to detectives, one name began circling faster than the rest, Rudy Arellano. Because when a woman disappears, investigators know to look close to home. And too often, home is where the danger begins. Morning light crept over Lake Worth in Fort Worth, Texas, with the same quiet routine it had for centuries. Fishermen set out before dawn, the water calm, the hum of traffic from Loop 820 bridge carrying above them. It should have been another ordinary day. But what they witnessed changed everything. At around 3:20 a.m., witnesses reported seeing something drop from the bridge into the water below. Not a splash from debris, not a casual fall of trash, but something heavy, weighted, and followed by a chilling sound. We heard screams. One man later told investigators, his voice breaking as he replayed the moment. It wasn't just a splash. Someone was alive. Someone was fighting. The call to 911 was urgent, confused, laced with terror. Within minutes, police cruisers and rescue vehicles converged near the lake's edge. Sirens pierced the dark. The swiftwater rescue team was dispatched, dragging the black surface of the water for signs of what had fallen. The air smelled of gasoline from idling engines, wet earth from the lakeshore, and the metallic bite of fear. When divers finally broke the surface again, the lake had given up its secret. Floating upward, held unnaturally stiff, was the body of a woman still clad in maroon scrubs. A rope was cinched tight around her neck, its other end lashed to something monstrous. A 119-pound block of concrete, still encasing part of a fence post, dragging her toward the bottom. The sheer brutality of it left first responders shaken. Detectives knew right away. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a simple drowning. This was a homicide staged with cold calculation. Elizabeth Pule Arellano had been alive when she went into that water. The autopsy would confirm it. Her lungs filled with fluid, her final desperate breaths drawn under the crushing weight of betrayal. Forensic investigators photographed everything with meticulous care. The concrete block was pulled from the water, tagged and logged. The rope fibers were analyzed. Even the knots told a story of planning, of intent, of someone who wanted her silenced in the most permanent way. When news of the discovery spread, Fort Worth recoiled in shock. Elizabeth wasn't a stranger to the community. She was a nurse, a mother, a familiar face at church and school functions. Her death was more than a statistic. It was a wound in the fabric of the neighborhood. Neighbors left flowers at her parents' home. Co-workers wept openly in hospital corridors. And everywhere, the same whispered questions echoed. How could this happen? Who could do this? Her sisters, Johanna and Alejandra, were among the first called to the scene. The image of their sister tied to concrete was unbearable, but what struck them most was the cruelty of it. She fought, Alejandra later said, her voice steady but laced with grief. She was still alive when they threw her in. She was fighting to come back to us. The horror of that detail haunted not only the family, but also the wider city. Experts on domestic violence spoke to local media, reminding the public of a grim reality. Women are at their highest risk when they attempt to leave a controlling partner. Elizabeth's case was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a larger, harrowing pattern. Police now had two parallel paths: comfort a grieving family and chase the evidence. The body, the rope, the block of concrete, all pointed to someone close, someone who had access. And though detectives were careful not to name suspects too soon, behind closed doors, the focus narrowed with unsettling speed. Because in almost every intimate partner homicide, there is one detail investigators can't ignore: the partner left behind. And in Elizabeth's case, that partner was Rudy Arellano. The discovery at Lake Worth was only the beginning. Once Elizabeth's body was pulled from the water, the question of how quickly gave way to who. Investigators knew they had a homicide, and now the hunt for the killer began. Detectives returned to the last place Elizabeth was seen alive, her parents' home in North Fort Worth. Her car was still parked outside, eerily undisturbed, keys still in the ignition. Her purse, her phone, everything she would have taken with her, sat untouched inside. To investigators, it wasn't just evidence. It was a chilling message. She had been taken against her will. Her phone records became the first thread to unravel. They revealed a timeline, a digital heartbeat that placed her estranged husband, Rodolfo Rudy Arellano, far too close for coincidence. In the early morning hours of April 16th, cell towers mapped Rudy's movements, his phone pinging off signals near Elizabeth's parents' home, then later near the lake where her body was found. Detectives requested surveillance footage from local businesses, toll booths, and highway cameras. And there it was, grainy but damning. Rudy's truck, its outline unmistakable, moving along the routes that stitched Elizabeth's disappearance to her death. The breaks came faster now. At Rudy's home, investigators found torn-up fence posts recently removed from his yard. Their bases were encased in concrete. To the untrained eye, it was normal home maintenance. But forensic analysts saw something else. The same type of concrete, the same dimensions, the same weathered wood as the block that had been tied around Elizabeth's neck. Then there was his truck bed. Investigators photographed the scattered remnants of concrete chunks inside. Dust, flecks, traces, fragments that told the same story as the one the divers had pulled from the lake. When compared, they matched almost perfectly. The case was building itself, one piece at a time. The rope that bound her, the concrete that drowned her, the car abandoned, the phone pings, the truck routes. Each detail was a note in a symphony of guilt. And still, Rudy tried to talk his way out of it. At first, he denied everything. He claimed he'd been home asleep, that he woke up later, that he had no idea what had happened. His tone was calm, almost rehearsed. the way a man might deny cheating on a test rather than the murder of his wife. But investigators knew better. Every time he spoke, his statements bent under the weight of evidence. When confronted with the surveillance footage, he adjusted his story. When asked about the concrete, he claimed it was from routine yard work. When pressed about his truck's movements, he tried to explain it away as errands, late-night drives, anything but what it really was. The detectives documented everything. Each inconsistency went into their files. Each lie became another layer in the case they were building against him. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's family waited in agony. They had always known she was trying to leave Rudy, that she wanted safety, that she wanted a future free from fear. But they never imagined the extent of the danger she was in. The community, too, began to see the pattern. Domestic violence advocates spoke out, pointing to the clear warning signs: the separation, the pending divorce, the escalation of control. This is the most dangerous time for a victim, one expert explained to the press. When the abuser feels their power slipping away, violence often follows. In this case, it had followed with chilling precision: rope, concrete, silence. By now, the whispers had turned into near certainty. People who once sat beside Rudy in church, who watched him coach, who thought of him as a husband and father, could no longer ignore the truth. The evidence wasn't just circumstantial. It was damning. And for investigators, one question remained. They had the body, the timeline, the truck, the concrete, and the rope. But what they needed now was a confession, or at least a decision from Rudy that would bring the case into the courtroom. By the time charges were filed against Rodolfo Rudy Arellano, the community of Fort Worth was already holding its breath. Investigators had gathered enough evidence to secure an indictment: capital murder, kidnapping, and the calculated killing of Elizabeth Pule Arellano. The weight of those words carried through the courthouse like a storm. Capital murder meant prosecutors were prepared to pursue the ultimate sentence: death by lethal injection. For Elizabeth's family, it wasn't about vengeance. It was about recognition. Recognition that her life mattered, and that the brutal way it was taken deserved the harshest of responses. The media descended, filling courtroom benches and spilling into hallways. Local outlets covered every update, every legal maneuver. Elizabeth's case was no longer just a family tragedy. It was a matter of public reckoning. Could love turn into a weapon? Could a husband, a father of 4, carry out something so unspeakable? Rudy entered his arraignment in shackles, his head low, his expression unreadable. Reporters scribbled notes, their cameras clicking as if trying to pierce his silence. He pleaded not guilty at first, his attorneys insisting the evidence was circumstantial. But behind closed doors, prosecutors built a case that was airtight. The phone records, the truck, the concrete, the rope, each detail stacked like bricks in a wall he could not climb. The trial loomed, and with it, the likelihood of the death penalty. Witness lists grew long: neighbors, forensic analysts, phone experts, even the fisherman who had seen a body plunge into Lake Worth that April morning. Prosecutors were prepared to paint a picture of betrayal, rage, and control, a man who could not stand losing the woman who no longer wanted him. Elizabeth's family steeled themselves. Her sisters, Johanna and Alejandra, her stepfather, Fidel Galvan, her mother, all of them prepared to face the man who had once been part of their family. They remembered family dinners, birthdays, holidays when Rudy had been welcome in their home, and now they would have to testify against him to look him in the eye and speak the truth of what he had taken from them. But in early 2019, everything shifted. Rudy's defense team approached the prosecution with a plea. He would confess to capital murder in exchange for a guarantee: no death penalty. Instead, he would serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never again walk free, never again hold his children outside the confines of prison walls. The decision was announced in a courtroom heavy with silence. Elizabeth's family filled the benches, clutching tissues, holding one another's hands, waiting for the words that would seal his fate. Rudy stood before the judge, his voice quiet but clear as he admitted guilt. With those words, the legal battle ended, but the emotional reckoning was only beginning. Victim impact statements followed. Elizabeth's sisters stepped forward, their voices breaking under the weight of grief. "You kidnapped her, you raped her, and then you threw her away like nothing," Johanna said, her words slicing through the courtroom air. "We all trusted you. You betrayed us all," Alejandra spoke next, her voice trembling but steady. "You didn't just take my sister. You destroyed the lives of 4 children who now have to grow up knowing what you did. You shattered our family. And still, we will say her name. We will not let her be forgotten." And Fidel, Elizabeth's stepfather, stood last. His face carried years of wear, sorrow etched in the lines around his eyes. "You had a choice. You could have walked away. But instead, you chose cruelty. You chose violence. And now you will spend the rest of your life where you belong, behind bars." In that moment, the courtroom was no longer about legal procedure. It was about memory, love, and pain. It was about a family speaking for the woman who could no longer speak for herself. Rudy showed little emotion. Some described him as stoic, others as hollow. But his silence mattered little. The record had been made, he was guilty, and the punishment was forever. Outside the courthouse, Elizabeth's family faced reporters with tears in their eyes. "We didn't get the death penalty," one said softly, "but at least we know he'll never hurt anyone else again." And so, justice, imperfect, incomplete, was rendered. But justice is not healing. Justice does not bring back laughter, or music, or the simple comfort of a daughter's voice. Justice only marks the boundary where law can no longer reach, where grief must do the rest. The courtroom emptied, but the silence that followed did not bring peace. For Elizabeth's family, walking out into the cool Texas air that day was like stepping into a world permanently altered. A world missing her laughter. A world missing the rhythm of her presence, the music she loved, the warmth she carried, the reliability that made her the backbone of so many lives. Reporters packed up their cameras. Headlines declared Rudy Arellano pleads guilty to capital murder. And then the cycle of news moved on, as it always does. But for her mother, her sisters, her children, there was no moving on. Only living with the sharp edge of absence. Elizabeth's children now faced a future without either parent. Their mother stolen. Their father imprisoned for life. Innocence broken by betrayal. The legal system had answered, but the family system had collapsed, leaving grandparents and relatives to pick up the pieces of lives scarred too soon. And yet, within this devastation, important truths began to surface. Advocates for domestic violence victims began pointing to Elizabeth's story as another chilling reminder. Separation can be the most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship. Statistics show that over 70% of intimate partner homicides occur after the victim leaves or announces plans to leave. It's not just about the bruises we see, it's about the control behind them. When control slips, rage follows. And Elizabeth's case embodied that reality. She had left. She had filed for divorce. She had sought safety in her parents' home. And still, her estranged husband found her. Still, he planned, stalked, and carried out violence with a cruelty that showed just how far some abusers will go to maintain power. Community leaders in Fort Worth began asking hard questions. Could more have been done? Were there warning signs missed? Could Elizabeth have been better protected by the law, by neighbors, by systems meant to safeguard women in crisis? NTHE evidence suggested she was alive when she hit the water. That haunting truth echoed through every retelling of her story. It underscored not only the brutality of her murder, but the urgency of prevention. She didn't have to die. With better intervention, perhaps she wouldn't have. Her sisters became her voice in death. At vigils, they held candles against the Texas night sky, speaking her name, refusing to let her fade into another statistic. Her stepfather, too, became a symbol of grief transformed into advocacy, reminding fathers, brothers, and sons that silence in the face of abuse is complicity. Faith communities joined in, holding services where hymns blended with tears. They remembered Elizabeth not as a victim, but as a woman who loved deeply, who gave freely, who wanted more for her children. Churches placed her name in bulletins, calling on congregants to be alert, to intervene, to recognize the hidden patterns of abuse. And in living rooms across Texas, her story sparked conversations. Mothers told daughters, "If you ever feel unsafe, tell me." Friends whispered to one another, "Don't wait too long. Don't go back." And survivors of abuse recognized themselves in Elizabeth, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that their silence could cost them everything. The lesson was brutal but necessary. Violence doesn't always come from strangers in the night. Sometimes it comes from the hand that once held yours, from the voice that once promised forever. In reflecting on Elizabeth's case, criminologists pointed to the concrete and the rope as symbols, not just physical evidence, but metaphors for entrapment. Abusers often tether victims in ways unseen: financial dependence, emotional manipulation, threats of harm. The concrete was literal in her case, but it also spoke to the heavy weight of control she tried to escape. As months turned into years, her name lived on in advocacy circles. Her story was cited in workshops on domestic violence, in police trainings, in shelters where women sought refuge with their children. Elizabeth became a reminder that safety planning isn't just about leaving. It's about anticipating danger after you leave. The legacy of her murder was both sorrow and warning. For her family, the reflection was simpler. They wanted her remembered not for the rope or the concrete, not for the betrayal, but for the person she was: a devoted mother, a kind daughter, a dependable friend. To them, justice was not only the prison sentence, it was the promise that her memory would not be reduced to headlines. And so, her story continues, carried in the voices of those who refused to let silence win. Elizabeth Pule Arellano's name deserves to live on, not as a headline, not as a tragic cautionary tale filed in court archives, but as a reminder of who she truly was: a daughter, a sister, a mother who loved her children fiercely, who worked in scrubs to care for others, who laughed in kitchens and left fingerprints of kindness on the lives she touched. It is easy, when confronted with violence, to let the brutality overshadow the person. But Elizabeth was not her death. She was her life, her resilience, her warmth, her attempts to rebuild even when the ground beneath her was unstable. When we speak her name, we do not honor the crime. We honor her courage, her humanity, and her refusal to stop trying for a better tomorrow. Yet her story also forces us to ask the uncomfortable questions. How do we prevent the next Elizabeth? How many warnings will be missed? How many families will bury daughters because silence swallowed the signals of danger? According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, nearly 1 in 4 women will experience severe intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. And research shows that the moment of separation, the decision to leave, is one of the most dangerous windows. For some men, control is identity. And when that identity is threatened, it becomes lethal. Elizabeth's life underscores that pattern. She had separated, she had taken steps forward, and yet, instead of freedom, she found herself stalked, lured, and betrayed by the very person who once vowed to protect her. Her story is not an anomaly. It is part of a pattern that repeats across neighborhoods, across states, across the globe. So what can we do? First, we can listen, truly listen. When a friend whispers that something feels wrong in their marriage, believe them. When a coworker shows up with excuses for bruises or constant texts demanding to know where they are, see the red flags. When someone says, "I think I'm in danger," don't brush it off with, "It can't be that bad." Sometimes it already is. Second, we can advocate for better systems. Law enforcement must take missing persons cases seriously from the first moment, not after hours slip into days. Courts must treat protective orders as shields, not pieces of paper that dissolve in the face of determination. Communities must build networks where survivors are not left isolated, but held by the safety net of neighbors, churches, shelters, and awareness. And finally, we can remember. Memory is resistance. Silence allows erasure. When we keep saying Elizabeth's name, when we tell her story to our children, when we whisper it in rooms where others might feel alone, we create ripples that say, "You are not forgotten, and you are not alone." To Elizabeth's sisters, Johanna and Alejandra, to her stepfather Fidel, to her children who carry both the light of her love and the shadow of her loss, we hear you, we grieve with you, and we promise not to let her vanish from memory. This is not just about Elizabeth. It is about every woman who left home and never returned, every mother whose laughter was silenced before its time, every family sitting in courtrooms begging judges to see what they already knew. So here is the call. If this story moved you, Share it. If you believe Elizabeth's memory matters, speak her name in the comments. If you want to stand with the countless voices erased by silence, subscribe to Vanished Voices. Because every listen, every share, every remembrance chips away at the culture of forgetting. Elizabeth's story ends in a lake. But it does not have to end here. Justice begins when silence ends.